So I'm going through my notebooks just to see if there's anything worth salt in them. And I've grappled with this question and continue to grapple with the question of what is this art and art therapy spectrum? And frankly, I think a lot of my resistance is toward certain feelings and judgments I have towards the self-help industry. If the approach is that art is a way for us to go deeper into our minds and understand ourselves better, then I think that was my resistance too, frankly, of just saying, well, yeah. And it's unfortunate that we seem to live in a society where art, like many other things, is put on this weird rarefied pedestal and commodified, and you need to have education and this and this and that to understand art, and in order to be an artist you have to be talented. And I really have resisted and rejected that viewpoint my whole life, because I'm somebody that really lives by trial and error. And so I never wanted to sit in the audience or just be an observer of anything, paintings, music, whatever it is in life. I always wanted to and want to feel it and experience it for myself. And whether or not that leads me to become a professional where people pay me for my work, which happens to have happened, then that's another thing altogether. And I think that has more to do with staying with something long enough and having enough inspiration and inner optimism, which I will get to in a minute with this quote I found, to continue practicing and finding the seam of what's alive for you in that, so that you gain some expertise or ability. Anyway, so I found these words from a book called Art as Therapy by Botton and Armstrong. And I just made note of a couple of ideas that they put forth that I thought were interesting. They proposed 3 critical steps to overcoming our defensiveness around art. So there's all kinds of defensiveness because art's been put on a pedestal and made elite. And then there's all of this commentary, which I make a distinction, that if a so-called artist is trying to convince you to come over to their side or to share their viewpoint, that's propaganda. That's not art. I think it's not that when you're making something, all of your biases and judgments don't come with you. But I feel that art aspires to, in my world, expression aspires to letting emotions and human experience come through. It's not about having an agenda. So I think I've talked about this before in terms of, okay, so I'm going to paint about the emotion sadness. I want people to understand that my paintings are about sadness. I ran up against that wall for so long before I started to understand that sadness is not something that's solid and can be captured and deposited onto a canvas. And these things can maybe at best be named after the fact. After you've finished, after a piece is finished, then you can say, oh wow, I see that this maybe came from this part of my experience. But guess what? Especially with abstract work, to expect your audience or another person to get that is kind of futile, and it takes all the fun out of it. So it's more about kind of letting the raw energy and experience through when you're working, when I'm in the laboratory, and then other people are going to make of it what they will. So anyway, getting back to it, Botton and Armstrong proposed 3 critical steps to overcoming our defensiveness. Acknowledge the strangeness we feel, and then be gentle on ourselves for feeling it and recognizing it's completely natural. So I interpret this to mean, if you have some kind of unpleasant response to a work, or kind of a WTF response to a work, be curious about that, because that's information about yourself. Even if it's just like, on a certain level, the work really repels you, or it's just really not a good, there's plenty of work that really is people's practice and process that's put out into the world, and it's said, this is art. And it's kind of like, there is also a distinction that I think is hard to determine. You got to give people a break when they're just starting out, that you put a lot of crap out into the world at first, and then you grow, and then it gets better. It's the nature of growing. So it's kind of like, okay, what's that reaction I'm having? And maybe it's just that the piece is amateurish, and I can see that. And why does that have to be like, ugh, that's so bad? It's just like, all right, it's just amateur. Second, making ourselves familiar and thus more at home with the mind that created that strange art. So this is where I think that having a little bit, when the artist leaves a story, if it's an accessible story about themselves and their process, that actually invites people in, that's where that's helpful. Because if you share where you're coming from, or kind of where you are looking at the piece yourself, then it invites people in, instead of trying to be up on this artist pedestal where, and I certainly can be accused of this, getting lost in the intellect and having all these lofty ideas that you hope your work is coming from and is going to translate, and people are kind of like, okay, I don't really get or see that. And that's a tricky territory to move through. It's basically, as I see it, it's getting lost in your intellect and trying to describe something that's sensuous and intuitive, or technical. Finally, the last is looking for points of connection with the artist, however fragile and initially tenuous, so we can relate to the work that sprang from the context of their life with the personal reality of our own context. So, just try to find, maybe there's one little color in that piece of work that resonates, or one little chord in that dissonant sound art that's a little bit interesting, or reminds you of a particular experience you've been through. So I think those are some kind of interesting, I think these people are, I did not read the whole book. I read an excerpt, and I am curious to read more, but they're coming from this similar place of, let's bring art back to humanity. It's not this rarefied special thing. We all have the ability to creatively express ourselves. The main keys are that you actually validate your likes, your dislikes, your attractions, your aversions, and explore them, so that when you begin to pick up some materials, you're not doing it only because someone you admire does that. You're also doing it because there's something there that is attractive to you. And slowly you can begin to kind of follow the clues to find a medium that you're really genuinely interested in and attracted to. And then it's basically largely a process of overcoming critical voices, so that you can just play and experiment and learn and grow. And if you keep doing that, then the work gets better and better. So then they go on to say self-awareness helps us to understand why we might respond negatively to a piece of art. And instead of disparaging it, they say prioritize understanding over self-righteousness. So obviously, rather than just chucking the piece of work out as being a piece of crap or whatever else, or not real art, just being curious about why it's triggering, what it's triggering within you. Our tastes, they say, depend on what spectrum of our emotional makeup lies in shadow and is hence in need of stimulation and emphasis. Every work of art is imbued with a particular psychological and moral atmosphere. A painting may be either serene or restless, courageous or careful, modest or confident, blah, blah, blah. And our preferences for one kind or another reflect our varied psychological gaps. So, yeah, then they go on to say, we hunger for artworks that will compensate for our inner fragilities and help us return to a viable mean. We call a work beautiful when it supplies the virtues we're missing, and we dismiss as ugly one that forces on us moods or motifs that we feel either threatened or already overwhelmed by. Art holds out the promise of inner wholeness. So it's interesting. I would just kind of summarize that in my own way by saying it's a way of dropping the critical storyline of, whatever emotion it is, particularly the uncomfortable ones. Oh, it's because of this and that and this in my life. It's, blaming, of course, I'm always talking about myself in these experiences, but, the tendency to blame circumstances of your life for feeling uncomfortable emotions. And funnily enough, there's always some situation in life that will trigger every single emotion that's possible. And so a piece of artwork brings to the forefront those emotions. And even if they are the so-called positive emotions, we have our limitations, our reactions, our fears about feeling those too. So the artwork is kind of this medium that doesn't have all we can experience it cleanly because it's it's so clearly an object outside of ourselves that provokes that internal experience. So there's an opportunity, there's space between when the emotion comes up within us in the context of our day-to-day living, and it's just within us, and we're probably kind of partially rejecting it if it's a painful one. But with a piece of art, maybe if it's a beautiful portrayal that brings also melancholy, a piece of music or a painting or something like that, then it allows us to just experience the pure emotion without all that temptation for personal judgment and personal storylines. So yeah, and then just to conclude, then they go on to say, one of the unexpectedly important things that art can do for us is teach us how to suffer more successfully. We can see a great deal of artistic achievement as sublimated sorrow on the part of the artist, and in turn, its reception on the part of the audience. The term sublimation derives from chemistry. It names the process by which a solid substance is directly transformed into a gas without first becoming liquid. In art, sublimation refers to the psychological processes of transformation in which base and unimpressive experiences are converted into something noble and fine, exactly what may happen when sorrow meets art. I would say that last sentence, I was grappling with that a little bit. It feels to me like a piece of work highlights a feeling within myself or draws it out. Right. Perhaps if you're already in a melancholic mood, then whenever you encounter a piece of work, you will find the sorrow there. And so the work becomes a reflection for that experience. And finally, just coming back around, if optimism is important, it's because many outcomes are determined by how much of it we bring to the task. It is an important ingredient of success. So again, this having optimism when you go into experiment with art, whatever art medium you're playing with. This flies in the face of the elite view that talent is the primary requirement of a good life. But in many cases, the difference between success and failure is determined by nothing more than our sense of what is possible and the energy we can muster to convince others of our due. We might be doomed not by a lack of skill, but by an absence of hope. So I don't know if I can add any more onto that. Just that we are all born with this capacity for self-expression. And it's the courage or the ability to find a way to be curious and move towards our experience, all the spectrums of it, that allow us to have the courage to keep coming back and engaging with something that gives us sensuous pleasure or it draws us in some way. I've really struggled with this a lot myself. Maybe everyone does at some point or another. When you're experiencing extremely difficult or painful emotions that you've habitually put under the rug, at a certain point, you can't avoid them anymore. And so going into the studio, there they are. And if there's critical voices attached to them, then guess what? Those critical voices go on to whatever practice you're engaging with. And then it can be easy to say, this is the wrong practice for me. All I'm feeling is pain when I go in. Why is that? And it's just that is on a deep level. I myself was really struggling, have been really struggling because of rejecting my experience, not knowing how to face my experience. And so, of course, when I go into the studio, my experience is there waiting for me. So therein, I suppose some people would say, lies the art therapy. You just walk right in there and meet your therapist and dig into, move through the pain, which pain itself is dynamic. All emotions are dynamic. They're not stagnant. We make them stagnant by repeating storylines. Okay, over and out.